The new kid at school, Daniel's heart thudded in his chest as he stepped off the bus, his eyes scanning Redwood High School for the first time. His backpack felt heavier than usual, the weight of uncertainty pressing against his shoulders. He had spent the entire summer dreading this day. Moving from a small, tight-knit neighborhood to this massive, unfamiliar school was more than just a change in scenery. It was a complete shift in reality. Daniel had been used to the concrete jungle of the city, where he was just another face in the crowd. But here, in the suburban sprawl of Redwood, he was the new kid out of place, an outsider. As he made his way through the gates, he felt the eyes of the other students on him. Some were curious, others outright judgmental. Whispers floated through the air, just loud enough for him to hear. He knew what they were thinking, what they were saying. He had been the target of that look his whole life, the look that judged him based on the color of his skin before they ever gave him a chance to speak, to show who he truly was. "Hey, look at the new guy," one voice said, loud enough for Daniel to catch, followed by a snicker. Daniel clenched his fists, trying to ignore the sting of their words. He had learned how to handle this, how to keep his emotions in check. Grandfather had always told him that the world would try to break him, especially because of who he was. But Daniel had a secret, a skill that no one at this school could even begin to fathom. He walked through the crowded hallway, his eyes straight ahead, determined not to let their stares break his focus. He had always been good at keeping his head down, at blending in when he needed to. His mind was already working, calculating the best way to navigate this new world, to survive the next few months without drawing attention to himself. But life had other plans. As he reached his locker, a group of jocks led by Jake Walters blocked his path. Jake was the kind of guy who oozed arrogance. He had the size, the swagger, and the crowd of followers who would do anything to please him. He was Redwood High's king, and everyone knew it. Jake's eyes landed on Daniel, a grin spreading across his face. Well, if it isn't the new kid," Jake drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. His friends snickered behind him, and Daniel could already feel the tension in the air. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew better than to engage with bullies. He kept his back straight, his hands loosely hanging by his sides. "What's up?" Daniel said, trying to sound nonchalant as he opened his locker. His voice was steady. Betraying none of the nerves that were gnawing at him, Jake stepped forward, close enough for Daniel to feel his breath on his neck. "You don't look like you belong here," he sneered. "What's a guy like you doing in a school like this?" Daniel knew this game. It was the same in every new place he'd been. People tried to put him in a box, label him, make him feel like he was different. But he had learned long ago not to let their words stick. He wasn't just some stereotype, just here to finish school like everyone else, Daniel said, keeping his voice calm, controlled. Jake laughed, the sound echoing in the hallway. "Yeah, I bet you think you're something special, huh? Maybe. You should hang out with the other outcasts. They're your people, right?" Jake's words were meant to sting, to create division, but Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his locker and looked Jake dead in the eye. "I don't need anyone's approval to be here." Jake paused, taken aback by Daniel's confidence. The jocks behind him muttered under their breath, clearly uncomfortable with Daniel's lack of fear. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Jake was the king, and no one stood up to him, especially not a new kid who didn't know the rules. "Well, you'll learn soon enough," Jake finally said, his tone turning cold. "We don't take kindly to guys like you trying to fit in." He shot a glare at his friends, signaling them to move. "But don't worry, we'll see how long that attitude lasts." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message had been sent loud and clear. He had just made an enemy of the biggest bully at Redwood High, and he knew this wouldn't be the last time. Jake or his cronies would try to make his life difficult. As Jake and his friends walked away, Daniel leaned against his locker, taking a deep breath. He had made it through the first encounter, but he knew that this was just the beginning. He had a long way to go before he could consider this place home. The whispers, the stares, the subtle digs he would have to endure it all, day after day. But there was something else brewing inside him, something that no one at this school knew. Daniel wasn't just some shy kid who would let bullies walk all over him. He had learned how to fight back in his old neighborhood. His grandfather, a former martial artist, had taught him everything he needed to know. Had the skills to defend himself, but he had never used them outside the comfort of his home, in his old life. Fighting had been about survival, about protecting the people he loved. Here, at Redwood High, it would be different. He wouldn't fight unless he had to, but if Jake or anyone else tried to push him too far, they would learn the hard way that Daniel was not someone to mess with. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the first period, Daniel took one last look at the hallway. He wasn't going to let anyone define him. Not Jake, not anyone. He was here to prove that he could stand tall no matter what. This was his new beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. The challenge. The following morning, Daniel walked into Redwood High with a sense of resolve. The stares from his classmates hadn't gone away, but he was starting to grow used to them. Every hallway he walked through seemed to echo with hushed whispers, but Daniel kept his head held high. He was used to being different, used to being looked at like an outsider. But there was something new now, something deeper, that made him feel like he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. As he made his way to his locker, he saw Jake Walters again. This time, Jake wasn't alone. His usual entourage of jocks and cheerleaders was gathered nearby, their eyes fixed on Daniel. Jake's eyes glinted with an unmistakable intent. And Daniel could tell that the challenge he had thrown down the day before was not over. Daniel's heart beat a little faster. He wasn't naive. He knew this was coming. Jake had made it clear that he didn't take kindly to being ignored or challenged. But Daniel had already made up his mind. He wouldn't be intimidated. He wouldn't back down. "Hey, new kid," Jake called out, his voice dripping with mockery. The group of jocks behind him laughed. "I heard you're good at keeping your mouth shut. But now, I want to see if you're any good at other things." Daniel stopped in his tracks, feeling the eyes of the school on him. Didn't need to turn around to know that Jake and his friends were surrounding him. Could hear their footsteps. Could feel the tension rising. "How about it?" Jake continued, walking up to Daniel, his voice louder now. "A little after-school fun, just the two of us. I'm curious to see what you're made of." Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers curling into fists. He had anticipated this moment, but that didn't make it any easier. He wasn't afraid of Jake. In fact, he felt a strange sense of calm, but he was also conscious of what was at stake. Jake wasn't just a bully, he was a symbol of the power dynamics that controlled this school. So if Daniel didn't stand up now, he would be nothing more than another victim. Someone to be pushed around. Turning to face Jake, Daniel kept his voice even. "I don't want trouble, but if that's what you want, fine. I'll meet you after school." Jake's grin widened, and for a moment it looked like he was about to say something else. But instead, he simply nodded, a look of victory flashing in his eyes. "Don't worry, new kid. We'll make sure it's memorable." As the group dispersed, Daniel stood still, letting the gravity of the situation settle over him. The challenge had been issued. He wasn't one to back down, not from anyone. But he knew the fight wasn't just about physical strength, it was about proving something much deeper to Jake, to the school, and most importantly, to himself. After all, Daniel wasn't just fighting for pride, he was fighting for respect. The hours before the fight dragged on like a slow-motion reel. Every class Daniel sat through felt like it lasted forever. His mind kept drifting back to the confrontation that awaited him after school. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some of them curious, some of them judgmental. Whispers followed him in the hallways, and when he passed by Jake's friends, they would throw him smirks. Their eyes filled with expectation. By the time the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Daniel felt a strange calmness settle over him. His thoughts were focused, sharp, as he gathered his things and walked out of the school building. He wasn't nervous, he was prepared. In a way, this fight had been inevitable, something that had been building up since the moment he'd stepped foot in Redwood High. It was just one more battle to face, one more test to overcome. When Daniel reached the back of the school, the field where the fight was to take place, he wasn't surprised to find Jake waiting for him. Jake stood in the center of the field, arms crossed, a cocky smile on his face as he surveyed the empty space. Behind him, his crew was gathered, standing like silent spectators, eager to see the new kid fall. Daniel's feet sank into the grass as he approached, his eyes scanning the area. He had fought before, but never like this. Never in front of a crowd. Never against someone like Jake. Jake's voice broke the silence. "You actually showed up? I thought you'd back out." Daniel stopped a few feet away from him. His eyes locked with Jake's, his body tense but controlled. "I don't back down." Jake laughed, the sound almost taunting. "We'll see about that." With a swift motion, Jake swung his fist toward Daniel, but Daniel was already one step ahead. He sidestepped the punch, his body moving like a shadow in the late afternoon sun. Jake's fist slammed into thin air, and before he could recover, Daniel took a quick step forward and landed a solid jab to Jake's ribs. Jake staggered back, his breath leaving him in a whoosh. Daniel didn't give him a chance to recover. He knew that in a fight like this, speed and precision were everything. He moved with a fluidity that surprised even him, his fists striking with a controlled power that left Jake reeling. The crowd behind them gasped, murmurs spreading through the air. Jake's friends looked on in disbelief as their leader struggled to land a blow. It all underestimated the new kid. "You're faster than I thought," Jake muttered, wiping blood from his lip. He was no longer the cocky bully that had faced Daniel just moments before. Now, he was the one on the defensive. And Daniel could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. But Daniel wasn't finished yet. He had no intention of letting Jake off easy. He could feel the sting of every insult, every sneer that Jake had thrown at him in the past few days. But more than that, he felt the pressure of proving something to everyone who had ever doubted him, to everyone who had ever tried to break him. With a swift movement, Daniel kicked out, hitting Jake in the chest and sending him sprawling to the ground. The crowd was silent, watching in shock as the bully who had terrorized the school for years lay on the ground. Gasping for air, Daniel stood over him, his breathing steady. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even sure if he felt victorious. He had done what he needed to do. He had stood his ground, and in doing so, he had sent a message. He wasn't just some kid to be pushed around. He wasn't the new kid anymore. He was Daniel, and he wouldn't be silenced. As Jake struggled to stand, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving the stunned crowd behind him. The battle had been won, but the war, he knew, was far from over. The aftermath, the next few days after the fight, felt like a strange mixture of calm and tension. As Daniel entered Redwood High, he couldn't help but notice that the atmosphere had changed. The usual whispers and stares were still there, but there was a new element to the air respect. It was subtle, but it was there. People no longer looked at him like he was just another kid to mock. They looked at him like someone who had earned his place, someone who had proven he wasn't afraid to stand up for himself. Daniel's first class of the day was English, and as he walked into the classroom, the usual chatter stopped. A few of the students shot him quick, nervous glances. He found his seat, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on him. Normally, he would have felt the heat of their stares, the pressure of their judgment, but today it was different. Today Daniel felt ... indifferent. The teacher, Mrs. Simmons, began the lesson. And Daniel did his best to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept drifting. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened after the fight. Jake hadn't shown up at school for the past 2 days. Word had spread that he'd taken a few days off to recover. The school was abuzz with rumors. Some said he had been knocked out cold. Others said he was so embarrassed that he had to hide out until people forgot about it. But what nobody knew, what they couldn't understand, was how it felt to walk into school that day, knowing that Daniel had finally done something he had been trying to avoid for so long. He had fought, and he had won. But winning wasn't everything. It was the respect that followed, the recognition that he wasn't someone to mess with anymore. As the bell rang for the end of the day, Daniel walked out of the classroom, feeling a sense of dread settle in his chest. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way the other students looked at him felt different now.
Oh.
There were no more taunts. No more mocking. At least not outwardly. but there was a silent acknowledgement in their eyes that he hadn't seen before. When he reached his locker, he was met with a surprise. Hey. Mia, the girl who had spoken to him in the cafeteria a few days ago, was waiting for him. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, a hesitant smile on her face. "Hey," she said softly, her voice hesitant but warm. "Can we talk for a minute?" Daniel was taken aback. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, especially not from someone like Mia. She was smart, popular, and well-liked by everyone. People like her didn't typically seek out people like him. Sure, Daniel said, trying to hide the confusion in his voice. Mia stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Daniel could hear. "I just wanted to say, you didn't deserve what happened the other day. You didn't deserve what Jake and his friends put you through." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I don't know what you mean. I was fine." Mia shook her head, her eyes sincere. "No, you weren't. I saw how they treated you, and I saw how you handled it. I just wanted to let you know that I'm not like them. I don't think you're some kind of punching bag for their amusement." Daniel didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to people like Mia acknowledging the things that happened to him. He was used to keeping his head down, to moving through life without anyone really noticing him. And yet here she was, someone who didn't need to say anything, stepping up when others hadn't. "Thanks," Daniel finally muttered, unsure of how to respond. "I appreciate it." There was a long silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that said everything without saying anything at all. Mia wasn't pretending to understand him. She wasn't offering false sympathy. She was just acknowledging what had happened, and for that, Daniel was grateful. "I hope you don't think I'm some kind of saint," Mia said after a moment, offering a sheepish grin. "I just... wanted you to know that not everyone here is like that." Daniel smiled, nodding. "Yeah, I get that. It's just... not easy." Mia seemed to understand. "I get it. It's never easy." Before Daniel could respond, he heard someone calling his name from behind. He turned to see one of Jake's friends, a tall guy named Mark, walking toward them. Daniel's heart skipped a beat, his muscles tensing instinctively. He had no idea what to expect. Mark was one of the guys who had always hung around Jake, and he hadn't been part of the group that had backed off after the fight. Mark's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that Daniel couldn't quite place. "Hey, Daniel," Mark said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Daniel exchanged a look with Mia, who raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. She gave him a reassuring nod before walking off to join her friends a few feet away. Daniel turned back to Mark, unsure of what this conversation would bring. "I heard what happened," Mark began, his hands in his pockets. "And I just wanted to say that I'm not like Jake. I don't think what happened was right." Daniel's guard was still up. He had no reason to trust Mark, no reason to believe that this wasn't some setup, a new way to humiliate him. But something in Mark's eyes, something raw, something vulnerable, made Daniel pause. "I don't know what you want from me," Daniel said, his voice steady but cautious. Mark's shoulders sagged slightly and he let out a sigh. "Look, I know I'm not perfect. I've done some dumb things, but Jake, he's not a good guy. I get that now. I just wanted you to know that I'm not on his side in this. I don't want any part of what he's been doing to you." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He wanted to ask why Mark had never spoken up before, why he had stood by and let Jake get away with everything. But he already knew the answer. Fear. It was the same reason most people didn't stand up. Fear of being ostracized, of losing their place in the hierarchy. It was easier to keep your head down, to pretend it wasn't happening. "Thanks," Daniel said after a long moment. His voice quieter now, but "I don't need anyone's pity." Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. "I get it. Just ... think about it, all right?" Daniel watched as Mark turned and walked away, feeling a strange sense of closure. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he stood there alone in the hallway, Daniel realized that things were shifting. Slowly but surely he was finding his place. It wasn't about fighting or proving himself. It was about earning respect, bit by bit. And as long as he stayed true to himself, that respect would come. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a spark of hope flicker inside him. Maybe this school, this world, wasn't so bad after all. The hidden side, the days after the encounter with Mark were quieter, but the tension in the air hadn't entirely dissipated. Daniel walked through the halls of Redwood High with a steady pace, the eyes of his classmates following him with a newfound sense of curiosity. He wasn't sure if they saw him differently now because of the fight, or if it was something else altogether. Maybe it was the way he held himself, the way he carried the weight of his past and his skills in silence. He wasn't sure, but he could tell that things were shifting. Jake had still not returned to school, and rumors were flying. Some said he was embarrassed, others said he was nursing a few bruised ribs, but the truth was, nobody really knew. Silence from Jake's camp was almost deafening. His absence had left a void, and in that void, Daniel felt something he hadn't expected, an unsettling sense of calm. The bullies were no longer as bold. The whispers in the hallway seemed softer now, less charged. There was a newfound peace, but it was fragile, like a sheet of glass ready to shatter at any moment. Daniel didn't know how to feel about it. On one hand, he appreciated the break from the tension. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a little hollow. He hadn't fought to win peace. He had fought because he had no other choice. And now, with everything quiet and calm, he realized just how much he had relied on the conflict to define his place here. Without it, what was left? That's when the calls started coming in. It was a Tuesday when Daniel's phone rang. During lunch, he looked at the screen and saw an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to answer. It wasn't like he had many friends here, and the last thing he wanted was to deal with more drama. But something in his gut told him he should answer. "Hello?" said his voice, cautious. "Daniel, it's Mia," came the voice on the other end. "I hope I'm not bothering you." Daniel relaxed slightly at the sound of her voice. Mia had been one of the few people at Redwood who hadn't looked at him with judgment. She had always spoken to him like he was just another person, not a symbol of something bigger like the bullies had. She wasn't afraid of him, but that didn't mean she wasn't curious just like everyone else. "No, not at all," Daniel replied, the tension in his voice easing. "What's up?" "I wanted to check in on you," Mia said, sounding concerned. "I know things have been a little crazy lately, and I wanted to make sure you're doing okay." Daniel leaned back against the wall, looking out the window. At the empty courtyard, the silence of the school felt heavy, suffocating, almost like the calm before a storm. "I'm fine," he said, but even to his own ears, the words felt hollow. "Things are quiet now. No complaints." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" Mia's voice was gentle, almost hesitant. "You don't have to pretend with me. I know what you've been through. Make sure you're not bottling things up." Daniel didn't know how to answer. He wasn't used to people worrying about him, especially not people like Mia. She had always been one of the popular kids, someone who could have hung with anyone. She didn't have to care about someone like him. So why did she? "I don't know," Daniel said finally. "It's just weird, you know. After the fight, I thought things would change. But now that they have, I don't really know who I am in all of this. I mean, Jake's gone, but I don't feel like I won. It's like I'm stuck in limbo." Mia's voice softened. "I get it," she said quietly. "It's hard when things change and you don't know where you fit anymore. But you're not stuck, Daniel. You're just figuring things out, and that's okay." Her words hit him harder than he expected. They were simple, but they carried a weight that made him pause. He wasn't sure if he believed them, but hearing someone else say them out loud made him feel a little less alone in his uncertainty. "I'm trying," said the words slipping out before he could stop them. "But sometimes it feels like no matter how much I try, I'm still just ... the new kid. I'm still the outsider, even now." "You're not the outsider, Daniel," Mia said firmly. "You're a part of this school, whether they like it or not. And the only person who can decide where you fit in is you." Daniel couldn't help but smile at her words, even though he wasn't sure he fully believed them. Mia had always been a steady force, someone who saw things clearly even when the rest of the world seemed clouded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope, one step away from falling back into the shadows of his past. "I appreciate you calling," Daniel said, his voice soft. "Really, I do, but I don't think I'm ready to figure it all out just yet." "I understand," Mia said, her tone kind. "Take your time. Just know that I'm here if you need someone to talk to. You don't have to do this alone." The conversation ended, and Daniel stood in the courtyard for a while longer, his phone still clutched in his hand. Mia's words echoed in his mind. "You're not the outsider. You're part of this school, whether they like it or not." He didn't know if he could believe that yet, but it was something to hold on to as the week went on. Daniel continued to go through the motions of school. The bullies had quieted down, and Jake's absence seemed to leave a void that no one was quite sure how to fill. Without the constant pressure of Jake's intimidation, the rest of the students had started to relax, treating Daniel with a new level of neutrality. It was as if the school had collectively decided to give him a break. But with that break came something Daniel hadn't anticipated: loneliness. He didn't have many friends here. And now, with the threat of Jake out of the picture, the hallways felt emptier than ever. He walked through the crowded halls, surrounded by people, but still felt like an outsider. People no longer mocked him or looked down on him, but they didn't engage with him either. They didn't reach out. It was as if he had faded into the background, no longer the target of bullies, but no longer a part of the social fabric of the school either. One afternoon, as he sat alone in the library, Daniel felt the weight of it all pressing in on him. His mind wandered back to the life he had left behind, to the streets where he had learned to fight not just for survival, but to make himself heard. But here, in the quiet of Redwood High, he felt like no one was listening. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Daniel looked up to see a familiar face, Mia, standing in the doorway of the library, her eyes searching for him. "Hey," she said, offering him a warm smile. "I thought I'd find you here." Daniel smiled back, feeling the heaviness in his chest lift slightly. "Oh yeah. This is the one place I can actually think without everyone staring." Mia nodded, walking over to the table where Daniel sat. "Mind if I join you?" He shook his head, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "Not at all." As she sat down, Daniel couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The turning point. The days that followed were some of the strangest Daniel had ever experienced. He had spent the last few years bouncing from school to school, always the new kid, always on the outside looking in. But now, for the first time in his life, he was starting to feel like maybe he wasn't an outsider anymore. The rumors about Jake's absence continued to circulate, but they seemed to have little impact on the school's daily rhythm. Things were returning to normal, and for once, Daniel wasn't at the center of the chaos. But that didn't mean everything had magically gotten better. The new peace had come at a cost. Daniel found himself struggling to understand his place in the school. Without the daily harassment, without the constant struggle to keep his head down, he had to face something more daunting: the emptiness of his own loneliness. For all the taunting and teasing, for all the threats from Jake and his crew, there had been something strangely comforting about the conflict. He had been fighting for his place, for the right to exist without judgment. Now that the fighting had stopped, Daniel realized that he didn't know how to exist without it. It was in those quiet moments, between classes or alone in the library, that Daniel felt the weight of it all pressing in on him. He would watch the other students, groups of friends laughing together, exchanging notes, making plans, and he felt an ache in his chest, a longing for something he didn't quite know how to obtain. He wasn't used to being in the background, wasn't used to feeling invisible. On a Thursday afternoon, I guess Daniel sat alone in the lunchroom. His phone buzzed on the table. He looked at the screen, seeing Mia's name flashing back at him. For a moment, he hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready to open up about everything that had been eating at him. But then, he remembered how she had been there for him when no one else had. How she had checked in on him when the fight with Jake had left him questioning everything. Taking a deep breath, he swiped the screen to answer. "Hey Mia," he said, trying to keep his voice casual, though he couldn't mask the fatigue that laced his tone. "Hi Daniel," Mia replied, her voice warm as always. "How's everything going?" Same as usual, Daniel said, picking at his lunch absent-mindedly. Nothing really changes. I don't know about that, Mia said softly. I've been hearing things. People are talking. Daniel paused. What kind of things? No, about you, about the fight. Everyone's still buzzing about it. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Yeah, I've heard it's not a big deal. It is a big deal, Mia countered, her voice insistent. You stood up for yourself. You proved something, Daniel. Wanted to shrug it off. Wanted to say that it was nothing, that it didn't matter. But deep down he knew it did. He had won that fight, but winning didn't feel as satisfying as he'd thought it would. The aftermath, the silence, the attention, the strange peace had left him unsure of what came next. Yeah, I guess I did, he said quietly, his voice distant. But I don't know if it's enough. Enough, Mia asked, her tone confused. Enough for what? Daniel took a deep breath. Enough to actually fit in here. Enough to stop feeling like I'm just passing through. I've been the new kid so many times, Mia. I don't know how to just ... stay. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Daniel's heart thudded in his chest as he waited for Mia's response. It wasn't easy for him to admit this, his fear of never belonging, his fear of always being on the outside. But something about her understanding, her kindness, which made it easier to open up than it would have been with anyone else. I get it, Mia finally said, her voice quiet and serious. You're scared of being stuck, of never truly having a place here. But Daniel, you don't have to fit in with everyone. You just need to find the people who get you. You've already done that. Daniel furrowed his brow. What do you mean? I mean me, Mia said, her tone soft but sure. And others like me. You've already shown that you don't have to be anyone other than who you are, and that's what makes you different. You don't need to fit into their mold. You just need to find your place, your own space. You've already started doing that without even realizing it. Daniel wasn't sure if he was ready to believe her, but something in her words rang true. He had spent so much of his life trying to fit into someone else's idea of who he was supposed to be. It had been exhausting. Maybe, just maybe, Mia was right. Maybe it was time to stop trying to force himself into a mold that wasn't meant for him. I don't know if I believe that, Daniel admitted, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. But maybe I'll try. Maybe I'll stop pretending. Mia's voice softened with understanding. You don't have to pretend, Daniel. You don't have to be anyone else. You don't have to do it alone. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He didn't know how to explain it, but hearing Mia say that he didn't have to do it alone felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. He had always been alone, always felt like the outsider. But now, for the first time, someone was telling him that he didn't have to carry everything on his own. Thanks, Mia, he said, his voice sincere. I don't know what I'd do without you. You don't have to worry about that, Mia said with a smile in her voice. I'm not going anywhere. They talked for a while longer, but as the conversation wrapped up, Daniel felt something shift inside him. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Maybe Mia was right. Maybe it was time to stop running, to stop being the new kid in his own life. Maybe it was time to start figuring out who he really was. That afternoon, as Daniel walked to his next class, he felt a subtle change in the air around him. The hallways still felt crowded and distant, but something inside him had started to clear. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was just trying to survive. He wasn't just waiting for the next fight, the next battle. He wasn't just fighting to stay in the background anymore. He was fighting to find his place. Maybe, just maybe, he had already started doing that. The reflection. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Daniel. After his conversation with Mia, something inside him had shifted. He didn't fully understand it, but he knew one thing for sure. He was tired of pretending. He was tired of pretending. To fit in, of pretending that he didn't care about being alone. And even though he was still trying to find his place at Redwood High, there was a small flicker of hope inside him that had been absent before. But, as always, life had a way of testing him when things seemed to be settling into place. It was the end of the school day, and Daniel was walking out of the building, his thoughts distracted by the conversations he'd had with Mia and the small, but noticeable, changes in the way people were beginning to look at him. He was about to head toward the bus when he heard his name being called, Daniel. He turned around and saw Mark, the guy who had spoken to him a few weeks ago after the fight with Jake. Mark's expression was serious. But there was an undercurrent of something. Was it concern? In his eyes, Daniel hadn't expected to see him again. He had assumed that the awkward conversation they'd had would be the last. Apparently that wasn't the case. "Hey man, can I talk to you for a second?" Mark asked, walking up to him with a hesitant smile. Daniel nodded, unsure of what to expect. "Sure, what's up?" Mark glanced around, making sure they weren't overheard. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "I don't know if you've heard, but there's been some talk going around about you. Not just about the fight. About, well, everything that's been happening since then." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What kind of talk?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not bad talk, exactly. Just rumors. People are saying things. People are looking at you differently, and it's not because of the fight. It's because ... Because of." "What?" Daniel asked, feeling his heart rate pick up. He didn't like the way Mark was talking, like he was afraid of saying something too blunt. Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Because of who you are. People see you differently now. Some of them actually are intimidated by you. But it's not just that. There are some people who think you're going to bring more problems to the school. They think you're going to be a threat." Daniel's chest tightened. He felt his stomach churn with frustration and confusion. "What do you mean a threat?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mark glanced around once more, his voice barely above a whisper. "They think you're a ticking time bomb, Daniel. That one day you're just going to snap. They don't know what to make of you. They don't understand you." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He had known deep down that his fight with Jake hadn't been the end of the story. He had known that winning the fight wouldn't solve everything. But hearing it so bluntly, hearing that people were still viewing him as an outsider, as a threat, stung in a way that was almost unbearable. He clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise in him. "So what? They think I'm dangerous now?" Mark nodded. "At some of them, yeah. It's like they see you as a time bomb ready to explode. And with everything that's happened with Jake, it's just made it worse." Daniel tried to keep his emotions in check, but it was difficult. He felt like he had worked so hard to earn a little peace, to show that he wasn't a troublemaker, that he didn't want to hurt anyone. But the way Mark was talking made it clear that no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many steps forward he took, people would always see him as a threat. They would always see him as someone who didn't belong. "So what do I do about it?" Daniel asked, his voice tight. Mark hesitated for a moment, then spoke slowly, as if weighing each word. "Honestly, I think you've got two options. You can keep doing what you're doing, keep being yourself, and let them think what they want. Or you can try to change things, try to prove them wrong, but it's going to be hard. It's going to take a lot of work." Daniel let out a breath, staring at the ground as he processed what Mark had said. Change. He had spent so long trying to change who he was, trying to make himself fit into a mold that wasn't his. But now, it seemed like the more he tried to fit in, the more people saw him as a threat. It didn't make sense. "You're saying I have to prove myself again?" Daniel said, his voice laced with frustration. Mark's expression softened. Prove yourself, exactly. But show people that you're not a danger. That you're not the problem they think you are?"
Oh.
Daniel felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. "Great. Another fight. Another challenge. Just what I needed." "No, man," Mark said quickly, holding up his hands. "Not like that. Just show them who you really are. Not the guy who fought Jake, not the new kid. Just ... you." For a long moment, Daniel stood there, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure what to think, let alone what to do. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let other people's opinions define him. He wasn't going to let them force him into a box he didn't belong in. "I don't know if I can change their minds." "Man," Daniel said finally, his voice quiet. "But I can't let them control how I feel about myself. I've spent my whole life letting other people decide who I am. I'm done with that." Mark nodded, seeming to understand. Good, just don't let them break you, man. You're stronger than that. As Mark walked away, Daniel stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over him. He'd always prided himself on being strong physically, mentally, emotionally. But this was different. This wasn't about fighting. This wasn't about proving he was better than anyone else. It was about showing people that he wasn't a threat. It was about showing them that he was more than the new kid, more than the kid who had fought Jake. It was about showing them that he was someone they could respect. Daniel stood up a little straighter, his mind finally beginning to clear. He wasn't sure how things would turn out. He wasn't sure how long it would take to change their perception of him. But he wasn't going to run from it anymore. He wasn't going to hide. He was going to face it head on. The reckoning. The next few days were filled with an eerie tension that Daniel couldn't shake. Even though the bullies had quieted down, even though the whispers had lessened, something about the school atmosphere still felt charged. It was like walking through a pressure cooker, each step an anxious breath, the temperature slowly rising. Every time Daniel walked into a room, felt the eyes on him, some curious, some cautious, and some filled with something else entirely, fear. The more he tried to brush it off, the more he realized that what Mark had said about being seen as a threat had some truth to it. People weren't sure what to make of him anymore. They didn't know if he was a ticking time bomb ready to explode at any moment, or if he was just another kid trying to survive high school. It was a Friday afternoon when everything came to a head. Daniel had been walking to his locker when he saw a familiar face, Jake Walters. Jake wasn't supposed to be back. Word had spread that he'd been home, recovering from the bruises Daniel had given him. But there Jake was, standing in the middle of the hallway, his arms crossed, glaring at Daniel with a look of pure venom. For a moment Daniel froze, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to turn and walk away, to avoid whatever confrontation Jake had in mind. But something inside him, something he hadn't expected, flickered. It was a flash of defiance, a reminder of everything he had been fighting for. He wasn't the same kid who had walked into Redwood High months ago, uncertain of his place. He had changed, and he wasn't going to shrink in fear anymore. Daniel walked forward, his eyes locked with Jake's, and when they were a few feet apart, Jake spoke. "You think you're tough now, huh?" Jake's voice was low and dangerous, his words dripping with contempt. "You think you've earned some kind of respect? You're nothing. You're just a kid who got lucky." Daniel's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't need your respect, Jake, and I'm not interested in what you think of me." Jake's smirk faded, replaced by something darker. He stepped closer, his chest nearly brushing Daniel's, trying to intimidate him, but Daniel didn't flinch. He wasn't the same kid who had backed down in the past. He wasn't the same kid who had been pushed around by Jake and his crew. "You think you're untouchable now?" Jake growled. "You're not. Oh. You're still just a new kid. You think people like you? They don't. They're just waiting for you to mess up. They're just waiting for you to crack." For a second, Daniel could feel the weight of those words settle in his chest. It was everything he had feared. The idea that no matter how much he tried to prove himself, no matter how hard he fought, it wouldn't be enough. But then he remembered what Mia had told him. "You don't have to prove yourself to anyone. You just have to be you." "You're wrong," Daniel said, his voice clear and calm. "I don't need to prove anything to you. I'm not going to let you dictate who I am." Jake's face twisted in fury. Before Daniel could react, Jake shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. The crowd that had gathered around them gasped, watching with bated breath. Daniel could feel the tension in the air, the collective anticipation of what would happen next. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. He could hear the pounding of his own heart in his chest. He wasn't afraid of Jake, but he knew this was more than just a physical fight. This was about everything he had been trying to avoid: the fear of being labeled a threat, the fear of being seen as someone who didn't belong. Daniel didn't fight back right away. He took a breath, steadying himself. He wasn't going to let Jake control the situation. The last time, Daniel had fought because he had no choice. This time, he had something more to prove. That he wasn't just the product of a fight. That he wasn't just defined by his past. He wasn't going to let Jake turn him into someone he didn't want to be. Jake lunged at him again, throwing another punch, but Daniel was ready. He ducked under the swing, moving with the precision and fluidity he had trained for. In one swift motion, he grabbed Jake's arm, twisting it behind his back in a hold that left Jake gasping for breath. "Get off me!" Jake snarled, trying to break free, but Daniel's grip tightened. "You've had your fun, Jake," Daniel said, his voice steady, unwavering. "But I'm done letting you dictate who I am." Jake's friends, who had been standing off to the side, exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure whether to intervene. But Daniel didn't look at them. His focus was on Jacon, the bullies, on the past that had followed him here, trying to define him. With a final twist, Daniel forced Jake to the ground, his body hitting the floor with a loud thud. The hallway was silent. No one moved. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and it was clear that Daniel was no longer the target. Jake lay there for a moment, panting before he slowly pushed himself to his feet. His face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. He glared at Daniel, his eyes filled with venom, but Daniel didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of Jake anymore. "You'll regret this," Jake muttered, his voice cold. But there was no real conviction in his words. It was as if he knew the battle was already lost. "Maybe," Daniel said, his voice calm, "but I'm done letting you control my life." For a long moment, the two of them locked eyes. Then Jake turned and walked away, his friends trailing behind him, their eyes filled with a mix of confusion and uncertainty as they disappeared down the hallway. The tension in the air began to dissipate, and the crowd slowly started to break up, murmuring. Amongst themselves, Daniel stood there, his chest heaving with the adrenaline, but his heart was oddly calm. The fight was over, but something had changed inside him. He had faced his fear, faced the one person who had represented everything he hated about high school, and he had come out on top not through brute strength, but by standing his ground. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had already proven it to himself. The whispers that followed him down the hallway were different now. People no longer saw him as the outsider. They no longer saw him as the kid who was just passing through. He was no longer the target of bullies. He was just Daniel, strong, unyielding, and free. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he finally belonged. The new beginning. The following week felt surreal. Daniel walked through Redwood High's hallways like a different person, or at least like someone the school had never seen before. The air around him was lighter, and the students seemed to part for him as he passed. There were no longer whispers behind his back, no taunts or mockery. The fear and uncertainty that had once hovered over him had faded into something new. Respect. Jake and his group of friends had kept their distance. Since the confrontation, and despite the unspoken tension, things had calmed down. Daniel wasn't the new kid anymore. He wasn't the outsider. He wasn't just the kid who had fought Jake. He was Daniel, a guy who had proven that he didn't need to fight for respect. He just needed to stand his ground. As he sat in the cafeteria that day, eating his lunch, alone, Daniel felt the hum of the school around him. It was familiar, yet it was different, in a way he couldn't quite explain. He glanced up and saw Mia across the room, sitting with her friends, but she was looking at him, offering a small smile. It was as if she knew what he had been through, as if she understood that this wasn't just about schoolyard bullying or social dynamics. It was about identity. It was about finding the strength to be himself, no matter what anyone thought. Daniel smiled back, grateful for the simple connection. He didn't need to be part of her circle to feel understood. The first time in months, maybe even years, he didn't feel like an outsider. After lunch, he had a free period, so he decided to go for a walk around the school grounds. He stepped outside into the crisp air, letting the sunlight warm his skin. The sky was a pale blue, with a few clouds drifting lazily by. The world felt still, as if everything had slowed down for a moment, giving him a chance to breathe. Really breathe. As he walked around the edge of the schoolyard, his thoughts drifted to the fight. He had proven something that day, not just to Jake, but to himself. He had faced his fear, faced the version of himself that had been running away for so long. He had stood his ground, and for once, it had been enough. It was all enough. But even as he basked in the calm of the moment, he knew this peace wasn't permanent. Life at Redwood High would never be without challenges. There would always be someone to judge, someone to criticize. But that didn't scare him anymore. The hardest fight he had ever fought was the one with himself, and he had won. Daniel sat down on the grass under a tree, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the world wash over him, the laughter of students, the chatter of friends, the occasional shout from a group in the distance. He could hear it all, but he didn't feel the need to be a part of it. He didn't feel the need to prove himself anymore. That was when he heard footsteps approaching. He opened his eyes and looked up, surprised to see Mark walking toward him. Mark wasn't part of Jake's group anymore. He had distanced himself from the bullying, and while he hadn't exactly become a close friend, he had become something else, an ally. "Mind if I sit?" Mark asked, gesturing to the empty space next to Daniel. Daniel shrugged. "Sure, go ahead." Mark sat down beside him, his eyes scanning the courtyard as if searching for something. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, but it wasn't comfortable either. Daniel wasn't sure what to make of it. Mark had helped him once before, but he wasn't sure where they stood now. So, ... That was some fight, huh? Mark finally said, glancing at Daniel. "You really showed Jake who's boss." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "It wasn't about that. It wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about proving something to myself." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, man. You've got everyone here's respect now. You've earned it." Daniel's gaze drifted over to the school building, watching the students mill around, chatting, laughing, going about their day. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, he had been the target of every joke. The outcast who nobody cared about. "I don't know," Daniel said slowly, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe it's not about earning respect. Maybe it's just about accepting it." Mark didn't reply right away. He seemed to consider Daniel's words, his face reflecting a bit of uncertainty. "I get what you're saying. It's weird though, you know. Everyone thought you were just a threat. They didn't think you'd be this ... calm. They thought you'd fall apart after the fight. But you didn't. You've been holding your own ever since." Daniel looked at Mark, surprised. "You think I've been calm?" Mark nodded. "Yeah. You've been solid. I don't know. You've got this quiet strength about you." People noticed that. The first time Daniel felt the weight of Mark's words. He wasn't used to being noticed for his strength, not in the way Mark meant. He was used to being seen for his size, his toughness. But this was different. Mark wasn't talking about his fighting ability. He was talking about his inner strength. The kind that didn't need to be flaunted or proven. The kind that didn't have to fight to be recognized. "I never thought I'd get to this point," Daniel said, more to himself than to Mark. "I've always been running from myself, running from the things that scared me. And now, for the first time, I'm not running anymore." Mark smiled faintly. "That's good, man. You've got a lot of potential. Just don't forget it. You don't need anyone to tell you who you are. You've already figured that out." Daniel's chest swelled with something close to gratitude. Maybe it was because Mark understood. Maybe it was because he was no longer the enemy. But Daniel felt something shift inside him, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. "I'll try not to forget," Daniel said with a small smile. The bell rang then, signaling the end of the break. Students began to gather their things, heading back into the school building for their next class. Daniel stood up, brushing the grass off his pants, and turned to Mark. "Thanks, man," Daniel said sincerely. "I didn't think I'd ever have a conversation like this with you." Mark gave a half smile. "Yeah, I didn't either. But here we are." They both laughed, and as they walked back toward the school building, Daniel felt a weight he hadn't realized was their start to lift. He had spent so much time trying to fit in, trying to make himself someone he wasn't, that he had forgotten the most important lesson. He didn't need anyone's approval. He didn't need to change who he was to fit into their world. The world was big enough for him, just as he was. As he walked through the doors of the school, he didn't feel like the new kid anymore. He didn't feel like a target or an outsider. Didn't feel like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. He felt like a part of something. Even if he didn't know exactly what that something was, He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt at peace.